Iran for a long time has been an enigmatic and confounding country, especially in the West. The people, its culture, and its traditions, often paradoxical, have been rarely understood outside the borders of Iran. Iran has a history that stretches far back into antiquity, home to some of the earliest, most complex societies in human history. The Iranian culture has been a huge influence in the cultural development of not just its own region, but across the Eurasian world. The exotic Persia of the early 20th century is, however, far different to the modern Islamic Republic. In the West, characterized as part of the so-called axis of evil, Iran, since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, has transformed itself into a powerful, centralized theocracy. After 2,500 years of monarchical tradition, Iran's shift to a republican theocracy is a unique period of time where a nation radically changes its course. This change, however, has not come easy. The 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran ushered in an era of brutal repression. The new regime built what the Ayatollah Khomenini called the Vilayat al-Faqih, a state where its political system is guardianship-based. This relies upon a just and capable jurist, a faqih, to assume the leadership of the government in the absence of an infallible imam. Essentially codifying the right to rule, the infallibility of an imam is a core part of the Shia doctrine. In this essay today, I will explore the causes of the 1979 Islamic Revolution of Iran. A lot of the information available, at least online, does not attempt to bring together the various different reasons that caused the revolution. It is often just portrayed as a messianic movement by the religiously conservative. The truth, however, is far different. Most popular discourse, at least online, fails to address the structural inequalities, poor socioeconomic conditions of 1970s Iran, the effects of the so-called 1963 White Revolution, and a host of other causes that led to the downfall of the Pahlavis. So, I want to start by providing a general background of the early revolutionary movements in Iran. I want to focus on the structural issues like the mismanaged economy, disenfranchisement of the millions of urban poor, the sycophancy and corruption in the royal court, and the complete autocracy of Muhammad Reza Shah's rule. As I said, I will be focusing on some of the most important causes of the revolution. I will not be discussing the Islamic motivation, the role of the ayatollahs behind the revolution, just because that is often the center of discussion. But I think the issues that I will discuss today were faced by everyday Iranians, which led to the anti-Shah protests of '78 becoming a popular revolutionary movement by 1979. I will also not be going into the events of the 1979 revolution, but maybe I will make another podcast just on the events of '78 and '79. But before we begin, I would like to remind all the viewers the ethos of this channel. All information brought to you here is collected from preeminent academics and professionals. You can see all the references in the description, as it is our mission to bring the highest quality, no-nonsense research to our viewers. Before we begin to look at the events of February 1979, it's important to have a general overview of Iran in the 20th century. At the dawn of the 20th century, Iran, much like its neighbor Turkey, had been a dying power. The slow decline of the Qajar state meant that Iran had become a decentralized state. Petty landlords, traditional tribal chiefs, alongside the influential ulama, the religious scholars, held sway in much of the country. By the 20th century, Iran had failed to effectively modernize. The Shah ruled on whims and traditions. A lack of constitution, political or any bureaucratic class, and the absence of any defined legal system meant that Iran had no institutions with which it could effectively govern itself. A century of capitulation to European militaries and then being forced to sign unfair, exploitative treaties had devastated the country. Incompetent Qajar Shahs conceded massive concessions to the British and other European mercantile houses. Reading from defeats in wars against the Russian Empire in 1813 and 1828, as well as the British Empire in 1857, not only was the Qajar government forced to grant countless concessions to foreign powers, but the Iranian bazaris, the traditional merchant class, were left in a highly vulnerable position as they were unable to compete with the numerous economic advantages gained by merchants from Europe. On 20th March 1890, Emperor Nasiruddin Shah granted a concession to a Major G.F. Talbot for full monopoly of the production, sale, and export of tobacco for 50 years. In exchange, Talbot paid the emperor an annual sum of £15,000. At the time, the tobacco industry in Iran employed over 200,000 people, and therefore the concession represented a major blow to farmers and the bazaris whose livelihoods were largely dependent on the lucrative tobacco business. During the spring of 1891, mass protests against the monopoly began to emerge in major Iranian cities. Initially, it was the bazaris who led the opposition under the conviction that it was their income and livelihood which were at stake. Affluent merchants such as Muhammad Kazim, the king of the merchants, played a vital role in the tobacco movements by organizing bazari protests as well as appealing to the well-known religious scholars for their support in opposing the monopoly. The ulama, or the religious scholars, proved to be a highly valuable ally of the bazaris, as key religious leaders sought to protect national interests from foreign domination. The tobacco protests of 1891 are very significant to our story. You see, this is the first time we see a public political alliance forming between the middle-class bazaris and the influential religious scholars. This nexus of two very powerful sections of society, deeply sewn into the traditional fabric of the nation, will go on to become the real force behind the 1979 Islamic Revolution. In his widely acclaimed paper, Bazaar-Mosque Alliance, The Social Basis of Revolts and Revolutions, Ahmed Ashraf states that the bazaar and the mosque are inseparable twins, have served for many centuries as the primary arena of public life in urban Iran. In pre-modern Iran, there was the true principal arenas of sociability outside of kinship relationships. In combination, they form the context in which city dwellers organize their communal life, and often, as a direct consequence, their political alliances. Historian Nikki Keddy also notes that the movement was significant because Iranians saw for the first time that it was possible to win out against the Shah and foreign interests. There is a direct line from the coalition which participated in the Iranian movement, culminating in the Constitutional Revolution, and arguably the Iranian Revolution as well. The Constitutional Revolution. The Constitutional Revolution began late in 1905 when respected sugar merchants raised the price of the commodity in the face of rising international prices. The merchants were bastinadoed and a rebellion broke out in the streets. When some of the ulama took sanctuary, the Shah promised a house of justice and other concessions, but the promises were not fulfilled. The Constitution of 1906 and 1907 was modeled on the Belgian Constitution with one major exception. The Iranian Constitution provided for a committee of 5 or more mujtahids to pass on the compatibility of all laws with the Islamic Sharia. By 1908, the Qajar establishment had had enough. The new Shah, Muhammad Ali, closed the parliament by a coup in 1908. Revolutionary guerrillas held out against the crown, first in Tabriz and later in Gilan, and then marched south to take Tehran. The second constitutional period saw a split between the moderate party, led by clerics, and the Democrats, who had a program of agrarian and social reform. But the British and the Russians provided the revolution's coup de grace in late 1911. The Russians presented an ultimatum demanding, among other things, that the Iranians get rid of their pro-nationalist American advisor, Morgan Shuster. Although the parliament passed some social, judicial, and educational reform, the revolution was chiefly political, aimed at reducing monarchical and foreign power through the introduction of a Western-style constitution and parliament. This instrument and this body were seen as the best means to limit Iranian autocracy. Some of the revolution's participants expected Iran and its people to be able to return to more Islamic ways, while a smaller number hoped to become more Western, if only to be strong enough to escape Western control. In this revolution, unlike that of 1978-79, ulama leaders did not adopt a new political ideology. Those who supported the revolution were content to occupy a high proportion of the positions in the parliament and to have a veto over legislation. The bazaar and the ulama. Bazaars in Iran are more than... By being situated at the major nodes of regional and global trade routes, merchant families accumulated wealth, prestige, and power. In doing so, bazaars also became central locales of political organization, in supporting or opposing the many rulers of Iran. The concentration of merchants, middlemen, and wholesalers in densely packed alleys under covered roofs created a social space where common grievances quickly coalesce, even between rich merchants, poor workers, and diverse ethnicities. The Bazaris of Tabriz and Isfahan, who took part in the 1905-1911 constitutional revolution, became local legends, and many Tehran Bazaris supported Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in his attempt from 1951 to 53 to nationalize the production of Iranian oil away from foreign control. The story of Iran's economic development under the Pahlavis, with all its successes and setbacks, is well documented. Between 1946 and 79, Iran was gradually transformed from a largely farm-based economy to a modern society by way of major changes in the traditional socio-economic order. Through public planning, urbanization, industrialization, diversification, and infrastructural investment, the state guided the economy and achieved sustained growth. Through control of imports, management assistance, and low-cost credit, the government helped the private sector and maintain an essentially free market system in those years, and particularly the decade and a half ending in 1978. The government was successful in achieving most of its economic, social, and military objectives. While the Shah helped modernize the social structure, he did little to develop the political superstructure. To permit the formation of pressure groups, to open the political arena for social forces, to forge links between the regime and the new classes, and to broaden the base of a monarchy, which, after all, had survived only because of the 1953 CIA military coup d'etat. On the contrary, he moved in the reverse direction, narrowed the regime's political base, and most serious of all, broke the ties that in the past had linked, even though tenuously, the monarchy with the traditional middle class. The traditional middle class remained important for a number of reasons. First, the bazaars, the stronghold of this class, numbered as many as 250,000 shopkeepers and controlled as much as 2/3 of the country's retail trade. The Tehran Bazaar alone covered some 3 square miles and housed over 10,000 stores and workshops. Second, the bazaars, unlike the modern classes, had been able to retain their organizations, especially their craft and trade guilds. Third, the bazaar entrepreneurs exercised considerable influence, not only over their store assistants and workshop employees, but also over thousands of peddlers, small retailers, and petty brokers. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the influence of the bazaar also reached into the countryside, partly because many of the commercial farms were owned by absentee entrepreneurs, and partly because some of the 430,000 small manufacturing plants located in the villages were subsidized by urban businessmen, employing less than 10 workers, most of whom were women. These small plants specialized in carpet weaving, shoemaking, and furniture manufacturing. Finally, the bazaars had social, financial, political, ideological, and historical links with the religious establishment. This establishment retained a great deal of political influence, in part because it had ideological hegemony over the shanty town poor, in part because it controlled the only nationwide organization that had remained independent in the state, and in part because it could mobilize over 90,000 clergy. In the period between 1953 and 1975, the regime's policy toward the bazaars was one of let the sleeping dogs lie. It watched carefully but took care not to arouse bazaar opposition. It spied on the trade and craft guilds but made no attempts to destroy or replace them as it had done with the factory unions and the professional association. It favored large entrepreneurs at the expense of small shop, but did not try to eradicate the bazaar economy. It financed clerics who supported the government, such as Ayatollah Behbani, and exiled those who openly criticized, notably Ayotollah Khomenini. But at the same time, it ignored silent opposition and took precautions not to alienate the entire religious establishment. This policy failed only twice. First in 1954, when the bazaars organized a 2-day general strike to protest the signing of a new oil agreement with the West. Second, in June 1963, when Khomeini, in his first political appearance, denounced the regime for rigging the parliamentary elections, allying with Israel against the Arab world, and granting capitulations to the American military advisors. Taking up the call, thousands of shopkeepers, peddlers, and students poured into the streets to confront the army. In 1975, however, the Shah abandoned the successful policy of letting the sleeping dogs lie. The change was necessitated by the Shah's decision to form the Resurgence Party, and thereby transform his military monarchy into a fascist-style totalitarian regime. Citizens were given the grand choice of joining the party or leaving the country. The aim of the party was twofold: to tighten control over the intelligentsia and the urban working class, and for the first time in Iranian history, to extend state power into the bazaars and the religious establishment. The Resurgence Party rushed where previous royalist parties had feared to tread. Within a few months of its formation, the Resurgence Party opened branches in the bazaars, dissolved traditional guilds, and created new ones under the direct supervision of state bureaucrats. The regime's attacks on the bazaars was further intensified during the spiraling inflation of 1975 and 77. Unable to control the inflation, the regime used the small shopkeeper as the major scapegoat and declared war on the bazaars. The mass media hammered away on the theme that bazaar profiteers were sucking dry the blood of the consumers. The Resurgence Party scrutinized store accounts with some 10,000 so-called inspectors. Meanwhile, the guild courts, set up to punish profiteers, jailed some 8,000 businessmen, shopkeepers and peddlers, exiled from their home towns another 23,000, and fined as many as 200,000 more. The regime waged a simultaneous war against the religious establishment. The Resurgence Party declared the Shah to be not only the political leader of the state, but also the spiritual guide of the community. The Shah himself announced the coming of a new great civilization. To hasten its arrival, he replaced the Muslim calendar with the new royalist calendar, and thereby jumped overnight from the year 1355 to 2535. When the religious leaders protested these actions, the regime cracked down. The main seminary in Qom was closed down. The Ayatollah Shamsabadi, a prominent preacher in Isfahan, was murdered a few days after he had spoken out against the new calendar. Sheikh Hussein Ghaffari, a 60-year-old Ayatollah, was detained in suspicion of aiding guerrillas and was tortured to death. Moreover, a group of prominent clerics were arrested for denouncing the Resurgence Party as un-Islamic and unconstitutional. This group included not only former prison inmates such as Ayatollah Talakani and Zanjani, but also many newcomers such as Ayatollah Beheshti and Montazeri. These people will go on to become very important members of the 1979 regime. The religious clerical opposition was further reinforced by another problem, the moral problem, created by unplanned urbanization. The dramatic influx of oil revenue led to a major construction boom. This, together with agricultural stagnation, drew millions of unemployed villagers into the cities. The number of migrants, which had totaled 3 million between 1956 and 71, jumped to over 380,000 annually after 1971. Since many of the migrants were young, unmarried, and unskilled, and since the cities lacked housing and social services, the new shanty towns produced predictable problems: crime, alcoholism, prostitution, delinquency, and rising suicide rates. Shocked by these problems, the mullahs reacted much in the same way as many clergy would react in other parts of the world. They argued that moral laxity had endangered society and that the only remedy was to enforce traditional values and religious laws. In the 19th century, England, haphazard urbanization produced the Methodist movement. In contemporary Iran, the same problem helped to create the Khomeini phenomenon. The White Revolution of 1963, great strides were made in the areas of health, education, and public welfare. The number of doctors increased from 4,500 to 13,000. The literacy rate rose from 26% to 42%, and the infant mortality rate dropped from 20% to less than 12%. But it was equally true that after 14 years of the so-called White Revolution, 68% of adults remained illiterate. The number of illiterates actually rose from 13 million to 15 million. Less than 40% of children completed primary school, and only 60,000 university places were available for as many as 290,000 applicants. The White Revolution was envisioned by the Shah as a way to bring his country into the modern world. It was true that for many families, the standard of living improved as they gained access to modern apartments and consumer goods, especially refrigerators, televisions, and motorcycles. But it was also true that for many urban families, the quality of life deteriorated as the shanty towns proliferated. The air became more polluted and the streets turned into traffic nightmares. Between 1967 and 1977, the percentage of urban families living in only one room increased from 36 to 43. On the eve of the revolution, as much as 42% of Tehran had inadequate housing, And despite the vast oil revenues, Tehran, a city of over 4 million, still had no proper sewage system and no proper public transportation. In a statement reminiscent of Marie Antoinette, the Shah's younger brother, who owned a helicopter assembly plant, asked, "If people don't like traffic jams, why don't they just buy helicopters?" It was true that the White Revolution financed the formation of farm cooperatives, drastically increased the use of tractors, harvesters, and fertilizers, and most important of all, transferred land to 1.6 million peasant families. It was equally true, however, that 96% of the villagers were left without electricity. Farm cooperatives were starved of credit, and agricultural production stagnated, mainly because of price controls on basic commodities. For any state to survive an economic crisis, and all states sooner or later have to confront such a crisis, it needs to have a social base and enjoy the support of a significantly large class. The Shah, despite the vast oil revenues, failed to obtain the necessary social base. He failed to win over the intelligentsia and the proletariat, and moreover, implemented socio-economic policies that drastically expanded their ranks without altering their previous opposition. Since there were no avenues for either channeling demands into the political superstructure or reforming the social structure, more and more members of these two modern classes found themselves completely alienated from the regime. Some emigrated or joined underground parties and guerrilla groups. The vast majority, however, internalized their anger and patiently awaited the day when they could express their years of frustration. I hope you have liked today's video. Please comment your thoughts, like, share, and subscribe. You can find the most relevant references in the description box above. And thank you so much for watching.